Hello, and welcome to the Critical Path Institute podcast. Our goal for this podcast is to connect the dots among our core competencies in regulatory science, biomarkers, data management and standards, clinical outcome assessments, and modeling and analytics, and how we accelerate drug development. CPath created this podcast for researchers, clinicians, and industry and regulatory professionals with the hope that these conversations and the resources we share will advance your efforts and partnerships to improve global health.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Critical Path Institute, or CPath podcast, where we connect the dots between science, medicine, drug development, and public health. And we've run 20 collaborations that have had some amazing impact, and today I am with the leads for two of those collaborations that focus on specific indications, specific conditions. One is type 1 diabetes, and the other one is Parkinson's disease. So with that, let me introduce you to these two amazing leaders. Let's start with Diane Stephenson, who leads our Parkinson's activities. Diane, take it away.
Hi, everyone. My name is Diane Stephenson. I'm the Vice President of Neuroscience at Critical Path Institute. I've been leading an exciting initiative, the Critical Path for Parkinson's Consortium, which we launched 10 years ago, and we're really excited to participate in this podcast today.
Excellent. Thank you, Diane. And Joe Hedrick.
Hi, everybody. My name is Joe Hedrick. I'm the Executive Director for the Type 1 Diabetes Consortium. Spent most of my career in industry working on autoimmune diseases like type 1 diabetes. Really happy to be here at Critical Path, and as Klaus mentioned, being able to turn data into actionable items for the regulatory authorities is an absolute key to advancing drug development.
Okay, awesome. There's an axiom in medicine that we don't treat diseases, we treat people. And so I would like for you to share with the audience what your consortia do to incorporate the voice of the people in their journey with the conditions that you help.
Yes, the voice of people with Parkinson's is front and center ever since we launched the Critical Path for Parkinson's Consortium. They're involved in all our working groups. They tell us about their journey from the challenges they have in being diagnosed with this disorder. It's far from a movement-only disorder that affects the motor system. The most burdensome symptoms are actually non-motor symptoms. And they teach us in all of our working groups what success looks like for them in terms of outcome measures, digital tools, quantitative methods for determining disease progression. And more recently, we have focus on how women are differentially affected with Parkinson's.
Joe.
Yeah, so with type 1 diabetes, it's an interesting situation. We've had insulin now for more than 100 years, and so there is a therapy that's very effective, but it's not without its problems. The introduction of newer technologies like continuous glucose monitors and insulin pumps have made it easier, assuming that a patient can get access, but these are still far from perfect solutions. It's complicated now by the realization that type 1 diabetes is a disease that starts many years before symptoms are experienced. So you can imagine yourself walking down the train track. You can see the train coming, but you can't get out of the way. And that train is going to hit you, and then from then on, you're going to be dependent upon insulin literally to stay alive. So the focus in type 1 diabetes of late has shifted into two areas. One, both focused on trying to either maintain or restore the function that you were born with. So for people who already have the disease, the promise is, can we get cell therapies that replicate what your own cells once did, but then also the idea of intervening before symptoms ever occur to try and stop the disease in its tracks so that you don't experience those symptoms moving forward. The challenge is you may not know that you're walking on the tracks. So that's the tough part with type 1 diabetes today.
Thanks, Joe. And linking that to connecting the dots across the drug development spectrum, we need to start talking about how your consortia are incorporating how to describe and quantify the journey of the condition even before symptoms appear. And there is a concept there that has been very important, both Parkinson's and type 1 diabetes, that has to do with the concept of staging the disease. I'm going to start with Joe this time because type 1 diabetes has been on this journey a little bit longer than Parkinson's disease, but the learnings certainly apply across many other conditions. So, Joe, please share.
Yeah, absolutely. I think type 1 diabetes has had the envy of the autoimmune community in the sense that they started these long-term natural history studies more than 2 decades ago now in a number of countries around the world, including the United States. That insight of being able to identify individuals who are on that path to symptomatic disease and then track them over the decades as they arrive has developed a staging concept based on the presence of biomarkers that can be detected in the blood. And what that's done is it's given you that awareness of, hey, you are on the train tracks. Now, the ability to intervene with new medicines makes sense, right? It doesn't make sense to give somebody a medicine if there's no chance that they're ever going to develop disease. But the staging paradigm now tells us not only that you're on the tracks and the train's going to hit you in 5 or 10 or 15 years. So having that allows the regulators then to think about, okay, well, what's the benefit of a given new medicine relative to the risk? This has changed the game and led within just the last couple of years to the first approval of a drug to delay and in some cases may prevent actually the occurrence of symptomatic type 1 diabetes. I think this is where drug discovery in this disease is ultimately going to wind up, and I think the disease will be eradicated at some point in the future.
Great, Joe. It's been incredibly exciting, and connecting the dots is really timely to see the journey of type 1 diabetes. It's really been instrumental to how CPP has really embarked on data that we brought into Critical Path Institute, starting with the first time of diagnosis, because that's when there was a lot of data there. But what's happened now in the field is that we now know also that the disease starts 10 to 20 years before symptoms, before the onset of clinical diagnosis. What are those signs that the train is coming, right? In Parkinson's disease, in the last just 3 years, there's been a tremendous progress in the evolution of novel biomarkers that consist of measures that could be assessed in human CSF as well as in neuroimaging methods. Now we can know in advance who is going to develop Parkinson's disease 10 or more years out with these reliable markers. That data is now coming to Critical Path Institute to allow us to embark on a staging framework with both longitudinal data from observational cohorts, as what Joe presented, but also from randomized controlled clinical trials. This data going to the FDA has really changed the game, and we were able to achieve a letter of support from the FDA last year in only 3 months, a record period of time, to help enable staging for Parkinson's in prevention.
Excellent. And with that approach, we will then have an impact on making sure that we facilitate the setup to run clinical trials for new medical products in people that don't have the overt clinical presentation of the condition yet, but that can be positively impacted by these new medical technologies. You both mentioned a term that I want to further connect the dots on, which is this concept of biomarkers. And for biomarkers in Parkinson's disease, you can look at images of the brain as well as certain lab tests. And in type 1 diabetes, you can look at multiple measures of how the pancreas is functioning and how the other organs are responding to that autoimmune damage, as Joe mentioned. But conceptually, there's a lot of similarities in how you think about the biomarkers to understand who's on the tracks at what part of the distance between themselves and the train that is going to hit them. So knowing that type 1 diabetes has been again, more mature in that sense. Joe, can you comment on those biomarkers and the journey we've taken?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first and most critical biomarker is the presence of autoantibodies to islet proteins. Islets are the organelles within the body that produce insulin. And when the autoimmune disease initiates, you see these autoantibodies that can be detected in the bloodstream years ahead of symptomatic disease. The issue with that has been, and while that has been absolutely critical, that data has been out there for 20 or 30 years, but never brought to the regulators in the types of analyses that they need to see in order to ask those benefit-risk types of questions. So a few years ago now, Critical Path and the Type 1 Diabetes Consortium brought these autoantibodies first to the EMA, and then in a commentary corresponding to that submission from the FDA, they recognized the ability of those autoantibodies to identify individuals who could be recruited into clinical trials to prevent or hopefully halt progression of the disease. The challenge that we have is that unlike Parkinson's, imaging of islets and beta cells in the pancreas has been extraordinarily challenging. So while the autoantibodies are great from a 10,000-foot view, sort of making a digital decision, you're on the path, you're not on the path, it's been a challenge to get the additional resolution to say, well, are you within stage 1 or within stage 2? Where are you? Are you a year out? Are you 5 years out? Are you 10 years out? There's some hints there. And some good data, but I don't think that we have the resolution today that we still need to really be effective at accelerating the development of medicine. In particular, and I think this is going to be a challenge for Parkinson's as well, you need to be able to make a decision early in these prevention trials because you can't conduct 10-year studies or you can't do very many of them, and that's a very slow development pathway to follow. So getting that additional resolution, having what are called surrogate endpoints of the disease that, again, the regulators can have confidence in, this is going to be the critical challenge for both type 1 diabetes and for Parkinson's in being able to make these decisions quickly and get these medicines to the patients much faster than we can today.
Yeah, it's again, connecting the dots. The journey in Parkinson's is pretty eye-opening if you think about where I started my career 30 years ago studying Parkinson's in the lab. It used to be that patients could not know what their true diagnosis was unless they had autopsy confirmation. Too late, right? With neuroimaging, what we did at Critical Path Institute was bring in patient-level data, both from observational cohorts as well as from clinical trials, that found out that at the end of clinical trials for Parkinson's, many of the patients at the end of the study did not have imaging deficits that is used to diagnose Parkinson's. They actually did not have dopamine deficits, even though they had clinical symptoms of Parkinson's disease. Well, how can that help, right? We cannot have successful trials if 15 to 20% of the people in the study do not truly have Parkinson's disease. We need better tools. So we brought all that data to the regulators, the FDA and the EMA, and we ended up achieving a qualification opinion such that in future trials at this stage, people that have to have imaging in order to know for sure that they have the dopamine deficit to be enrolled in the trial. And now over 90% of clinical trials utilize dopamine transporter imaging to include their patients in the trial. This is a very important biomarker now that's going to be done in conjunction with alpha-synuclein seeding assay to detect misfolded alpha-synuclein in the CSF as a way to identify at-risk individuals to enroll in trials that have promising therapies that are aimed at halting progression of Parkinson's prior to onset of symptoms. This is where the field is, and CPath, by bringing in all the data, we can apply our core competencies in data science, standardization, and quantitative modeling analytics to quantify disease progression and bring that data to the regulators in a way that no one organization could do.
Thanks, Diane. And you both mentioned something really important. It's not just about the distance between the individual and the oncoming train, but it's also the speed at which the train is moving down the tracks. And Diane, you mentioned something really important, how to integrate, further connecting the dots between the imaging tests and the lab tests and what's going to happen clinically, at what rate, and how that enables a more optimal decision frame approach for the design and the conduct of the clinical trials to test new therapies. But I want to emphasize a point, and I would like for you guys to help me share with the audience how we've done that and what the experience has been in making sure that we generate the necessary scientific confidence for the adoption of those solutions, and how the regulatory bodies are key in that journey. You mentioned the word qualification, and there's other types of pathways with regulators, but the bottom line is how those pathways review different types of drug development solutions, not as products, they're not diagnostic devices, they're not drugs, but they're equally important in accelerating drug development. So this time I'd like to start with Diane, because Parkinson's has been longer in that journey of interfacing with regulators.
Yes, thank you, Klaus. One of the most frustrating things for me being in industry is sitting around the table and seeing how it was to design a clinical trial, how to choose how many patients one would need to enroll in a trial to see a beneficial effect of a disease-modifying therapy. Every single trial I was part of had this conversation, but it was oftentimes not data-driven. One of the things we've done in now Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and Huntington's disease is to take data that includes rich clinical data, biomarker data, and genetic data to inform what's called a drug disease trial model. This is designed to take the guesswork out of industry trying to identify how many patients they would treat and what type of patients over what duration of time. The drug disease trial model that we were able to achieve endorsement or a regulatory fit for purpose decision from FDA for Alzheimer's disease is now eliminating the guesswork, so that now we know if we're going to test a drug for a particular stage of the disease, even now for prevention, we have data behind that to know if we don't choose this many patients in this population, we will not be able to be successful with the drug. And now we know those models could have predicted the failure of many trials that I worked on when I was in industry. We're doing now this in Parkinson's and in type 1 diabetes as well. And this is really key to having the regulators make sure that before we test drugs in patients, that we know that the trial design is as optimal as we can based on data.
Yeah, I think this is a really important point. You know, there's been a lot of studies done in type 1 diabetes, both in the new onset setting as well as in the prevention setting. So, and I don't want to ignore the new onset space here as well. So we have really had a huge advantage of being able to capitalize on those trials that have been done, and academic, government, and industry sources have all been extraordinarily generous with CPATH in providing us with the data from their trials. And this has been key into the recent submission of what's called a univariate model of C-peptide. C-peptide is one of those critical biomarkers, more important in the new onset setting, but also potentially useful in the prevention setting. And it's just as Diane said, many of the trials in type 1 diabetes have been modeled for very good reasons off of what organizations like TrialNet and others have done. But it's sort of like, well, this is how they designed their trial. We'll design our trial more or less the same way. The tools that we're developing, the C-peptide model that's been recently submitted, the multivariate model that will incorporate C-peptide, HbA1c, and insulin, will utilize the largest combined database of both natural history and clinical trial data in order to provide this kind of clarity that Diane just spoke of within Parkinson's. Again, I think we need to do more in the prevention space. The resolution there, I don't think, is going to be as high as we would like it, but that's the next step, and you have to get the first step in first.
Yeah, and speaking about first steps, there's one key dot connecting component there as well, and that is that we don't start from scratch with anything that we do, because we bring every relevant actor that has contributed before into the equation to avoid reinventing the wheel. And that speaks to the notion of collaboration and how the drug companies collaborate, how the academicians collaborate, how the regulators are part of the journey, and how the people are part of the journey. So I'd like for you to comment on that collaborative environment and how nothing of what we do happens in a vacuum. Let's start with Diane.
Yes, this is probably one of the most rewarding aspects of my role in leading the Parkinson's Consortium and the Alzheimer's Consortium is bringing all the different stakeholders together. A key example I'm most proud of that isn't that very well known is almost every conference I've been to, we have patients that get up and say, how come I don't know what happened in my trial? How can I learn from the results even if the trial failed? What can I do so that research results can share back with me? Well, at CPATH, we leverage every single patient worth of data from every trial, even if the trial did not succeed. In Parkinson's disease, we were the first to now recently share data that we collected using digital health technologies, smartphones, from people living with Parkinson's disease to understand their journey in the home. We shared the data back with the individual participants, and they told us not only did this information help them learn about what is Parkinson's, things that they thought were nothing to do with Parkinson's, but they shared that information not only with their physician, but their families, and it helped them manage their disease in completely new ways. So by sharing data with all stakeholders and by having shared data with us, we're helping patients in their journey, which is so critical for everything we do.
Yeah, repeating, at least conceptually, a lot of what Diane had to say, we've been really privileged to have a wide array of stakeholders involved in the efforts at Type 1 Diabetes Consortium. The academic community, who's been doing this for a long time, has been very generous with their time and their thinking. We have patient advocacy groups that are involved, places like Breakthrough T1D that fund a lot of the research that's been done in T1D, and they want to see that brought home to have meaningful solutions for the patients, the people that are investing in Breakthrough, to see these kinds of things happening. CPATH is an important part of that. I think the other thing that we bring to the table, which oftentimes, and I don't want to forget our industry contributors, all of them have been phenomenal as well, and they bring a different and important perspective to this, as they're the ones that ultimately are going to be responsible for developing these drugs and bringing them to the market. But I think a lot of times people forget about the regulators in all of this. They have a difficult job. They are going to approve medicines for thousands of individuals. If something goes wrong, they're going to be the ones that are literally on the hook, oftentimes along with the manufacturers. So those decisions have to be made in an objective and data-driven way. And so understanding that regulatory perspective, and I think this is an area where we could do a lot to improve, is thinking about regulatory endpoints as well as scientific endpoints of clinical trials. We're often asking great scientific questions. Obviously, we're looking at what is happening to the patients. Are they getting better or not? But oftentimes the data isn't collected in such a way as to then optimize regulatory decision-making down the line. I think if we could get better at that, we can take a lot of the white space in drug development off the table, and these solutions will come to patients much faster as a result. But that requires looking down the line, sometimes decades, but we have an opportunity to do that now.
Absolutely. And this is the time to make sure that collaborations happen. And I want to close with commentary from you both regarding how important it is for these collaborative spaces to be neutral, and how our neutrality provides that confidence that the data and the evidence are going to speak for themselves to make sure that any solution that is intended to address an unmet need in drug development actually does that with full scientific, clinical, and regulatory confidence. Let's start with Diane.
Thank you so much. This topic of our neutrality is so critical, and we bring in new stakeholders all the time. In fact, today we just welcome a new member organization. And I think trying to have them understand how how our neutrality works is really participating actively in our consortia. We have different industry sponsors that are competing with each other for patients to go in their trials. We have patients involved. We have academic scientists that are leading the way. But most importantly, as Joe said, we have the regulatory. The regulatory agencies are part of our teams. And in the past, I always learned in industry that people always perceived, and still to this day, that the regulators are part of the problem, part of the barrier, part of the challenge for them to solve, and how are we going to help them overcome that. But no, it's the other way around. The regulators are part of our teams, and they can be influenced only with data. We have all these people coming together with strong personalities and opinions that their hypothesis, that their opinion is right. But it's the data that paves the way. And the regulators have this incredible role, not only in catalyzing data sharing, but to make sure that every decision they make is front and center, looking at patient safety and efficacy. And so we have this unique opportunity through data sharing and being neutral to provide that information. And these tools make sure that future companies don't have to try to do this burden on their own. These tools are now going to streamline drug development for every future application.
Yeah, I think this point of neutrality is probably the critical piece. We're not patient advocacy, although we may feel strongly about the areas that we're working in. We're not industry. We're not trying to develop a particular product or a particular drug. We're not the regulators. We're not going to be making the decisions. What we are, or what we represent, or what CPATH represents, is the neutral data broker and analyst. We can provide objective views of the data, what it tells us, and just as importantly, what it doesn't tell us, what maybe are the gaps that need to be addressed from a regulator's perspective. Again, enabling them to make responsible decisions on behalf of the public that's affected by these new medicines. There's nobody else that I'm aware of that can say this. So CPATH has a unique role and a unique niche. Everybody can trust us to be objective with the data and not to have a particular position other than seeing these regulatory pathways be put into place to enable rapid drug development and ultimately for solutions for patients and their families. That's what it's all about.
Absolutely. And so as you can see, we don't make the drugs, but we make the drug development process better, faster, less risky through collaboration. Thank you so much to Diane and Joe for sharing their experiences and their views. And with that, we'll see you next time. Thank you so much.
Did you enjoy this episode? Share it with a friend or colleague, or leave a review on iTunes, and help others discover and support our mission. We are welcoming guests with a range of experiences and viewpoints. The views expressed belong to the guests themselves. Learn more about Critical Path Institute at cpath.org. That's c-path.org. Stay tuned for our next episode coming soon, and thanks for listening.